Welcome back to another Team ContiBreak video, and this time we'll be having a deck profile of Mr. Zorga. Yeah, the Alchemagic deck, so the other half of the Stoicheia nation for now. This is technically the dark side for Stoicheia, since Magnolia's the other half. They're all cutesy and whatnot. So a few things about this deck. I thought I would be maining Barrow Magnus for overdress, but once I tried this deck out, it just clicked for me. So yeah. So this deck is a consistent with how you play the games, which is why it's very fun, and it's also a very fresh take on playing Vanguard, since this deck focuses on orders more than actual rear guards. So I feel like the Alchemagic builds will branch out in future sets, because as of now you only have like 2 to 3 orders that you play in the deck, or normal orders that you play in the deck. So yeah. So for the usual, we'll be going through the deck build itself, your deck building options, and your deck matchups, together with your pros and cons. So before we start with the deck build, I would just like to plug the recent results of our D Standard tournament in Honors Ground. So I'll be showing it somewhere in the screen. So yeah. Okay, now moving on to the deck build. I think this deck build will still be the same even after Festival Collection arrives, because I think you won't be using any cards from there, since one is for Magnolia, or you can still get that 15k booster because that's still huge. So this is for your right deck. So grade 3 is your Zorga, which is the main person of the deck. And your grade 2 will be Blacktear's Husk Dragon. Your grade 1 will be Rancor Chain. And your grade 0 will be, it's either this or Latte. I'll be aiming to get the SP Latte on the Festival Collection so that I can switch starters. Moving on to your other grade 3s now. For the main deck, we have 3 Zorgas to complete the set, since Persona riding is a big part of closing the game. Next will be 2 of Hydraulic Ram Dragon. So you only run 2 copies of this because I feel like, or because you only have like 2 front row rearguard circles, which will most likely be occupied by these 2, or one of them and one of Black Husk Dragon. Moving on to your other grade 3s will be your orders. So 3 of Grief, Despair, and Rejection, 3 copies of that. Be moving it here. Next to your grade 3s will be your Cursed Soul, Squirming in Agony. This is a very cost heavy and deck heavy card, so I feel like you're only going to be using this once or twice in a game, or even you're not even going to use it at all. It's just there so that you will not be locked with just playing one order in a turn, so that your Alchemagic will be consistent. Moving on to your grade 2s, you have your Black Husk Dragon. So this is a very good early game card because of its second skill, that if you played an order, it gets +5 during that turn. So very big beater over here. So these 2 are gonna be your main beaters for this deck. So they're your main offensive cards. Moving on will be 4 copies of Hindrina. So this will help you mitigate your costs, so that you won't have to be soul blasting a lot. There's also a good Lightning Rod in case you want to bluff that you have cards to guard with in your hand. So just keep playing her in the front row, and your opponent might redirect one attack towards her. Last on your grade 2 lineup will be Ghost Chase, one of the most useful cards in this deck. It enables possible persona riding, reusing of your overtrigger once you've used it to guard. Then, yeah, so that's just a very good card right there. Also allows you to rush with your 15k guard triggers and just get them back. Next is your Sentinel. So moving on to your grade 1s. Yeah, we'll focus. So, planar Prevent Dragon at 4 copies, because that's pretty much the standard for Vanguard, running a set of your Sentinels. Next I'll be running another copy of Rancor Chain. This is a 10k booster. So yeah, I like 10k boosters. It makes magic numbers with Hydro Rail, and it makes your first greedy turn with Black Tears Husk Dragon even worse for your opponent. So moving on to your next grade 1s, or the last of your grade 1s, Spiritual Body Condensation. So very good early rush card. Yeah. So 4 copies of this. This will most likely be your main Alchemagic target together with Grief, Despair, and Rejection. Now moving on to your triggers. So 1 of the Stoicheia overtrigger, Bless Favor. So you can only run 1 in deck. 4 copies of Abyss Temptation. So that's 4 crits. 2 SP. Not necessary, but feels good. Another 4 crits, so you'll be running 8 crits in this deck, because it just speeds up your games a lot more, and you don't really need to draw rear guard since you can just call them from drop zone. Next will be 3 draws. You can opt to fronts if you don't feel comfortable with drawing. And then the last of your triggers will be, of course, your 4 heals. So this is a basic layout of the deck. Should probably work on my lighting sometime soon. Yeah. But that is it for your basic build. Okay, now for your deck building options, I don't really recommend putting in any other cards aside from just rearranging the quantity of your orders, so you can switch one of the Cursed Souls into Grief, Despair, and Rejection to make it a set. If you're not comfortable with having him, Hydraulic Rail, you can just switch it to other grade 1s so that you have more guard value in your hand. Or you can put Ghost Chase to a set, and you can adjust your draw triggers for fronts. So yeah, mostly this build I came up with was from me playtesting on players from my locals and results from games we played once I initially built the deck. So this is the result of that. So if you have a lot more specific nations in your locals, I think it's best for you to adjust to them so that you'll have a higher chance of topping in your locals, I guess. So yeah. So now that we have our deck build, we shall go through our pros and cons of this deck. One of the great positives of this deck is that you can create a powerful field with only using 1 card from your hand per turn. This would mean that you'll just be playing an order from hand per turn that will be used for Alchemagic with another order from your drop. So most likely the card in your drop zone will be Spiritual Body Condensation since you've used it in your turn 2. Or you can just use the Cursed Soul Squirming in Agony, check your top 4, and then just go from there. Next pro is that you have early hand advantage because of the draws from a Ranger chain when he's the Vanguard. So this means that if you drew your grade 2 units or your draw triggers, you can just place them down to attempt an early rush. Again, going back to Spiritual Body Condensation, he's gonna be a big part to your early game if you have it in hand, so I'd suggest that you keep it in your mulligans. Your third advantage will be that your resources are easy to gauge. So usually you only have you only need one counterblast per turn for grief, despair, and rejection. But you can also opt to getting 2 counterblasts, one for reviving Hendrina usually, so that you can just pay the soul costs without really having to. So yeah. Your fourth advantage will be that what you use from your hand can be used again from the drop zone. So this is a shout to the Grand Blue mechanics, because they all really like Grand Blue units except for Hendrina and Hydraulic Ram. So once you've guarded with your rear guards, you can just superior call them back. Once you've guarded with your triggers, you can also still superior call them back and Ghost Chase. Again, Ghost Chase. Very, very good card. Your last pro will be that Persona Riding isn't a must to win your games, but it can help. Because technically you're just Persona Riding every turn because of Grief, Despair, and Rejection. Now that we've talked about your pros, we're moving on to your cons. I don't really have a lot listed down for the cons since I don't really see that much while using this deck and playing this deck. Maybe I'm just being blinded by it, but yeah. If you can point out some disadvantages to me, that would be nice so that I can probably work on it with the deck build. So one of the cons that I've seen is that decking out may happen if you're not careful, especially against, or I've only had that experience with Prison, yeah. Since our hand cards are relatively huge, we've just been surviving each other's turns to the point where I've run out of Grief, Despair, and Rejections and Spiritual Body Condensations that I had to use Cursed Soul, Screaming in Agony just to have a decent numbers for my lanes. So yeah, decking out may be a problem if you're not that careful, or if you're having a bad hand, then all you get are orders with the mill thing, which is Curse Souls, Screaming in Agony. Bushiroad should probably work on renaming orders, just saying. The other con that I've seen is that a bad starting hand will cripple your game. So if your hand doesn't really have that much orders, it will really be difficult for you since you won't be doing much on your turn, and when you get your order, it will probably result from your drive checks. So that will not be giving you enough guard value. Yeah, so that's what I've seen, but you know, a bad hand for every deck is just bad. Now for the last part of this video will be your specific deck matchups. So this is not really gonna be true every time. It's just a looking at the deck matchup at face value. Since I haven't really practiced a lot against all the different decks from overdress, I've only faced them during our sanctioned tournaments. So moving on to the first nation for Dragon Empire, facing against the Nirvana deck, the overdress Virina decks. You don't really have to attack the rear guards at this case, just go face, since you'll just be delaying your win con once that happens. Once you attack the rear guards, I mean. So yeah, just hit face. For you, facing against the next deck, which is Eugene. Again, it's a Eugene deck. Once they get better support, they may be a problem, but for now, if they get a God Hand, then I think that's gonna be the problem. Moving on to the Dark State matchups for the Final Rush one. For the Final Rush Bruce deck, I'd advise you to go for early guarding, so that by the time they get their Final Rush turns, it'll be easier to guard, because their numbers are just huge at that point, so it will help to just early guard and just use one CV a turn. Next in our Dark States matchups will be against Barrow Magnus. Since they use a lot of their hand cards for soul charging, I suggest for you to try to rush them in the early game, or try to win as soon as possible, since the longer the game goes, the most likely that you'll lose against them because of their win conditions. So yeah, moving on to Keter Sanctuary. For Bastion, kind of the same with Barrow Magnus. They usually don't have any cards in their hand to guard with in the early game because of their grade 3s and stuff. You can almost expect them to have 3 grade 3s in their hand to proc Rook's skill when Bastion rides over Rook. You have to reveal 3 grade 3s to draw a card, so that should be an indication for you that you can assume that their hand contains 3 or more, or 2 or more grade 3s in their hand. Next is for fighting Hexiorb. Or Hexiorb. They have their intended flow for their turns. So I think with their deck mechanic, yours will be more consistent. So just in that alone, I think you have the advantage. Haven't really played against a single Hexiorb deck, so I really can't say much about it, but that's what I think. Now for Stoicheia decks, facing against Magnolia, the person with the better rush will most likely win. That's for the early game, but once you reach your grade 3 Zorga turns, it will be difficult for them to guard. So once you've reached that point, I think you have the advantage, but once they Persona Ride, that will be much worse. And also if you're unlucky with your damage check for triggers, then that's spells GG most likely for you against Magnolia. Moving towards the next deck will be the Mirror Match, facing against a fellow Alchemagic deck. So in my opinion, the first to reach grade 3 and the player with the more orders in hand will most likely win. Since you already know what each other's decks do, I think you can adjust. Early guard, things like that. Early rushing. Yeah, factors like those will most likely turn the tide towards your favor. And of course, since you have 8 crits, yeah, the person who checks more crits and heals, and of course over trigger, as usual per game against any other decks, will most likely win. So moving on to our last nation, which is Brent Gate. So Prison, Police, Aurora Star. I don't know what to call this type of deck. In my opinion, games against this specific deck usually take longer. It may even take the game to where either of you are gonna deck out. This will depend on your early turns and how likely you are to heal. So if anything, I think if you know how the Prison deck works, you should be able to play around it. Since I think it's safe to just let them imprison 2 of your rear guards before you reach grade 3. And then, once you reach grade 3, I think you can just go for filling your field. Since you have Grief, Despair, and Rejection, they're gonna use a lot of hand cards, and they possibly might not have another unit that can imprison aside from Seraph Snow. And that's how my games went, so I'm not really sure about how it'll turn out for you guys, but there's that. And the last deck will be Orphis. Orphis. You'll most likely have enough resources to guard your lanes, especially when they cannot Persona Ride, since it's just a 30k lane. It's just a 20 guard, most likely without triggers. So since you won't be using cards from your hand to call rear guards, I think you have more than enough to be able to guard your turns. Yes. That was it for our deck profile for Zorga, the Alchemagic deck. So I would like to ask for your suggestions, comments on this build, since I'm also trying to make this optimal as possible. So for the other Stoicheia deck, I will not be the one doing them. Your infamous Glad Shark will be the one who will be doing that instead. And so this is it for the deck profile. Bye.